His name is Kinship, Caste and Class, Early Societies circa 600 BCE to 600 CE. Now, historians use textual sources to understand socio-economic and political conditions and the changes thereof during the period under study. Now, in this chapter, we are going to be looking in some detail at the Mahabharata, which was composed over a period of 1000 years, starting around 500 BCE. Now, the Vyasa Mahabharata in its current form has 100,000 verses, and the central story is about two groups of warring cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Now, as we begin this chapter, we are told about the critical edition of the Mahabharata, which actually forms the basis of a lot of the study conducted by historians into the socio-economic and religious norms of society of this period. So, this ambitious project began in 1919 under V.S. Sukthankar and took 47 years to complete. There were certain methods used to compile the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. Most importantly, what the scholars were doing was comparing verses from all the known Sanskrit versions of the Mahabharata, and the selected verses appeared in most of the versions, were selected and then put into the critical edition. Now, the critical edition appears in a number of volumes with a total of about 13,000 pages. Now, this massive study rather hinted towards two major points. One, that there were several common elements across versions from Kashmir and Nepal to Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So, right across India, we have several common elements in these versions. But there are many variations as well. So these variations have been documented in the copious footnotes. So when you look at a typical page in the critical edition of the Mahabharata, it's only about one fourth of the page which covers the actual verses. And three-fourths of the page is actually footnoting to tell you about the different variations in different versions of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. So what do these variations explain, or what do they hint towards? One, that variations reflect the complex processes and changes that were taking place in society. So every time, you have a slightly controversial story in the Mahabharata, it sort of hints at certain changes that the society is undergoing. It's an uncertain time. People don't really know what are the proper norms. For example, if you look at, how Pandu, Dhritarashtra, and Vidur were born. Their mother's husband was already dead, and the mothers had to follow the practice of niyoga to conceive their sons. So it reflects certain changes in society which people are still coming to terms with. Now, the variations also hint towards a dialogue between the dominant traditions and the local traditions. Yes, so dominant tradition perhaps would be, let's say, one woman can only have one husband in a lifetime, whereas Draupadi comes to have five husbands in the same lifetime, right? So perhaps Draupadi's polyandrous marriage was, part of local traditions, which kind of becomes part of a main narrative. So there is a dialogue in the epic about this, right? So the variations probably explain this kind of dialogue. Sometimes the dominant tradition won out, sometimes the local tradition won out, but local traditions were then given a kind of a spin, which we will handle later in the discussion. These variations also represent conflict and consensus. So they may have been conflict of interest. For example, if you look at Eklavya's story, it's a question of conflict where Eklavya, who is not a Kshatriya, becomes a very good archer. So he needs to be, put in his proper place, as it were, right? And then there are episodes of consensus. For example, Karna, who was supposed to be lowborn, right? And he's not accepted as an equal to the Kuru princes. And that's when Duryodhan offers the kingdom of Anga to Karna to kind of make him an equal to the rest of the princes as well. So that we can look at as an example of consensus. Now, initially in the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when historians actually began to look at Sanskrit texts as a source of rediscovering India's past, they saw the text as definitive. So whatever the Sanskrit texts are saying, that perhaps was the way things were in the past. But later on, when the scholars began to study the Tamil, Pali, and Prakrit texts, um, they accepted the Sanskrit traditions as normative, but also did these Sanskrit sources also often questioned the Brahmanical norms and often rejected them as well. Um, So we will come to the question of social contract theory according to the Buddhist understanding, Buddhist beliefs in a later part of the discussion. But you must keep this a point in mind. And historians actually attempt to understand social processes, social changes through these debates actually between the Sanskrit and the vernacular, traditions and the debates between them. Now let's look at kinship and marriage and the various rules that governed these two areas. And did everyone practice this, or were there varied practices as well? So, how do we find out about families? So, generally, how do we define a family? So, any group of people are considered to be the same family if they are sharing food and other resources, and they live and perform rituals together, perhaps under a common roof, or at least live very close to each other. Families are often parts of larger networks of people who are defined as relatives, or to use a more technical term, a sociological term, they're called the kinfolk. So your cousins actually might be considered your kinfolk. Now, what's interesting is that in some communities, the kinfolk are actually seen as part of the family itself, whereas in others, anyone who is not related to you by blood are seen as extended families or kinfolk. Now, it is easier to find out about elite families, obviously, than ordinary folk, because we have inscriptions, we have textual material, which sort of list out these families and kin relationships. But for ordinary folk, we have no such evidence. So, is it safe to assume that ordinary folk also followed the same rules of kinship and marriage? It's very difficult to say, and attitudes towards family and kinship would influence decisions and lead to further social change. Now, again, this is something that we will be talking about in some detail in further discussions. So, when we look at family, we look at the ideal of patrilineage. So, Mahabharata, of course, traces descent from father to son. This is how the Brahmanical traditions also accept, not only in terms of name but also in terms of inheritance. The War of Mahabharata actually establishes, this descent in terms of, father to son and rightful inheritance. So Pandu was king. So Pandu has to give up his kingship and he has to go into the forest. And because he has no sons at that time, his brother kind of takes over. And later, when the Pandavas come of age, they stake their claim. They say, well, our father was king, you were only stepping in. That is, their uncle was only stepping in. Here, Duryodhan says, but my father is the current king, so I should become the king after him. Right? So, Mahabharata sort of establishes rightful norms of rightful inheritance. But we also know about variations in case of absence of sons or brothers. In the absence of sons, sorry, brothers and sons-in-law could also be considered as successors. But sons were important to continue the lineage, which is why even today we see in Indian society that the birth of a son is celebrated, and there is this whole talk about how when we die, it is the son who is going to perform our final rituals. Now we come to the rules of marriage. Now, there were certain rules of marriage which were set down by, the Dharma Shastras, Dharma Sutras, Manusmriti being one of them. So, one of the norms that was set down is Gotra exogamy. That is, two people of the same Gotra cannot marry each other. Now, daughters' marriage, especially in the elite community, had to be regulated to the right person and the right time. So when you look at Draupadi or when you look at Sita's marriage, there is always this thing about, they have to marry the right man. So in both these cases, when you look at Sita's marriage or Draupadi's marriage, actually these women really have no agency in this, right? So only a person of a certain caliber can perform can perform the feats that were set by the two princesses' fathers that they set. So Kanyadan becomes an important religious duty of the father. So if the daughter remains unmarried, it is supposed to be, unmeritorious for the father. The father will not attain heaven if he is unable to get his daughter married to the right person. And as life began to get more complex around the 6th century BCE with growing urbanization and establishment of empires, old norms begin to get questioned, right? So, therefore, as we said earlier, Brahmins lay down social codes in which 8 forms of marriage are recognized, of which 4 are considered good and the other 4 are rejected. Right? So your textbook does have, one of the sources which talks about two good forms of marriage and two forms of marriage which are not accepted by them. But actually, the numbers are four and four. That is eight forms of marriage. Now, what about gotra of women? Now, this is a very interesting area of study. Now, each gotra was named after a Vedic seer, and all those who belonged to the same gotra were regarded as his descendants, which is why same gotra marriages were frowned upon, right? Because you were descendants of the same person. So it was seen like, incestuous relationships if the people of the same gotra got married. So, yes, as we spoke about this one rule, there is another rule about gotra, and that is that women were expected to give up their father's gotra and adopt that of their husbands on marriage. So this whole concept of a woman's name changing after the surname, at least even today, when women are kind of expected, though not legally anymore, but women are expected to change their names after marriage. It is a part of this gotra norm, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, that members of the same gotra could not marry each other. Now, were these rules followed universally? The Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras would have us believe that. But when we look at some other kind of alternative sources, the picture is a little different. So let's look at the example of the Satvahana women. When we examine the names of these women, now these women have not been directly named, but when we look at the names of their sons, who were Satvahana rulers, that sort of gives us a hint into what Satvahana royal women's names could be like. For example, the name Gotami or Vashishti come into the picture. Now, both of these are actually Gotra names after Gotama and Vashisht. Yes. So the rulers or the men of the Satvahana family were named uh, in such a way that their mother's name was included in their larger titles. So we have the Gotami Puta Siri Satkani, Vashishti Puta Siri Pulumai. These were two rulers of the Satvahanas. Question is, why would the mother's name be included in the son's name as well? Now we know that the Satvahanas were polygamous, that is, a man had multiple wives, and perhaps to identify the mother from whom the rulers were born, perhaps their names included their mother's name as well. For example, the Pandavas are also known as Kaunteyas, right, or the sons of Kunti. Shatrugna and Lakshman, they are known as Sumitra Putra. Um, and Ram is known as Kaushalya Putra, right? So the mother's name did, get some recognition somewhere. But also, when we look at the coming back to the Satvahanas, when we look at women's names, it seems that the women did not change their names after marriage. Because if they did, then there would be no Gautami and Vashishti, and rulers being named Gautami Puta and Vashishti Puta when they were, part of the same lineage, right? So perhaps the women kept their names even after the Gotra names, even after they married. So perhaps the Satvahanas did not follow all the Brahmanical norms, right? And what we also see is that Satvahana women have certain Gotra names and they pass on their names to their sons as well. It may also hint that the Satvahanas did not always follow Gotra exogamy either. So again, this is an area where Brahmanical norms are not always being followed. Now, you do get questions in the board exams on giving examples of how of whether Brahmanical norms were universally followed. So these are some of the examples you can give to show that though they were considered to be part of social code, not every community stood by those norms, right? Now, because the mothers' names are featuring in royal names as well, does it mean that the mothers were important? So Satvahana rulers are identified through metronymics. So were mothers important? Now for this we need to be very cautious. So let's look at a few things. One, succession to the throne is patrilineal. So it's not a certain mother whose son is becoming a king, right? So your kingship does not depend upon who your mother is, but it depends upon who your father is, right? Then when we look at the contrast between Kunti and Gandhari, now, Pandavas always seem to be obeying Kunti, including, Kunti's injunction when she said, you share what you have brought. And it so happens that what they brought is Draupadi, but they cannot disobey their mother. So, that whole that whole concept of Draupadi, therefore, coming to have five husbands. Whereas Gandhari is pleased to keep peace and not go to war against the Pandavas, fall on Duryodhan's deaf ears, right? So again, I think authority and power of women perhaps was also dependent upon their own personal charisma. That being said, you also have Prabhavati Gupta, who is, regent to her son after her husband dies. Her son has not come of age, so she has to be regent. And as we saw in the previous chapter, that she was even giving land grants. So some mothers seem to have been more powerful and more important than other mothers. Now let's go on to the next section.